The soaring cost of housing has placed home ownership out of reach for many cities across Europe. This at the same time as rental prices are soaring. Who can still afford to live in some of the world's most expensive areas? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. The high cost of living and increase in house prices across Europe has left many lower income households struggling to make ends meet. For the first time in decades, younger generations could have fewer opportunities than their parents. So why is the housing situation so bad?
Tens of thousands have been taking to the streets of Lisbon for more than a year now, furious over soaring rents and house prices in the Portuguese capital.
We're here to say the government's measures don't convince us, and there's a huge housing crisis today. This is a social emergency and the government seems to remain unaware.
With my salary, which is higher than the average salary in Lisbon, I cannot afford renting a flat because it's too expensive.
Those on lower incomes are being priced out altogether. Some on the lowest wages, including many foreign workers, have resorted to living in tents on the outskirts of the city. Over in Prague, capital of the Czech Republic, the disconnect between housing prices and local salaries, coupled with a hike in energy costs, has left many having to choose between paying the rent and staying warm. That's if they can afford to stay in the city at all.
If you think of essential employees such as teachers, policemen, firefighters, they're probably unable to afford any kind of apartment in Prague nowadays.
A hike in interest rates has slowed down rising house prices, but has also meant steeper mortgages across the EU. And with rents still going up and the shortage of housing stock still unresolved, will many young Europeans and prospective first-time buyers remain locked out of the housing market for years to come?
Well, let's meet our guests. In London, Manjinder Atwal is Director of Housing and Property Litigation at Duncan Lewis Solicitors. In Dublin, Rory Hearne is Associate Professor in Social Policy, that's at Maynooth University, and he's the author of Gaffs, Why No One Can Get a House. And in Brussels, Sorcha Edwards, who is the Secretary General of Housing Europe. Sorcha, I'll come to you first. Are we now at a stage in Europe where, for many young people, affordable housing, getting on the property ladder, it's basically a dream that's not going to happen?
It's indeed, if we just look at one indicator, and that is the house prices, and see how much they've risen, even just since 2010. So I'm just looking at my notes here, 50% higher in Q3 of 2023 than in 2010. And if you take into account that we are now facing what many describe as a perfect storm in a huge slowdown in delivery of new homes, and that's across all sectors, so also in the social housing sector, we see that indeed, particularly in places where young people want to live because they can access, training, education, transport, services, facilities, the prices are just really over and above what people can afford and way out of line with income. But of course, what we would like, the dream that we would like to see is that access to home ownership is just one choice of many. So we would like to see sufficient supply of decent public, social, cooperative, limited profit housing, so that people are actually choosing to live in the long term and rent in the long term in public accommodation and social housing. And we see that the countries that are performing best, I mean, there's no perfect country at the moment, but the countries that are performing best are actually those that offer good quality, limited profit, public or social housing. And people actually make that choice because they've got security of tenure, they've got affordability, and they've got quality. So indeed, perhaps this dream we are talking about, young people are not going to dream of this elusive home ownership, but in fact a more flexible and modern approach, and that is decent access to secure rental ownership. So this is, I think we should also at this moment of crisis question what are people dreaming of, and is home ownership the ultimate dream? Is it the best option for a well-functioning, competitive, inclusive society?
Those stats you mentioned, Sorcha, from your organisation, Housing Europe. So house prices up 50% in a decade, rents up 19%. Manjinder, what kind of a message does this send to young people? I mean, life is just getting so expensive for them, isn't it? So much money going on rent.
Oh, definitely. I mean, in the UK, I believe our housing system needs to be fundamentally rebalanced. The private rental sector needs to play a smaller role. What we need to do is build new homes, particularly social homes, to address the issue of homelessness and overcrowding, and deliver affordable home ownership properties. The rent is extortionate. Young buyers are finding it difficult to go onto the property ladder as a result. So people are being forced to rent properties that are probably not in good condition, and this does need to be addressed.
Rory, I understand you believe that home ownership should be enshrined in the Constitution. Is that correct?
Well, not that home ownership as such. No, what I believe is that the right to housing, the human right to housing, should be enshrined in the Constitution. And essentially that is set out by the United Nations, which is an understanding and approach to housing, which is that housing should be affordable, it should give security of tenure, and people should be able to access it. And what we've seen in Ireland, and I suppose in many ways Ireland is experiencing one of the worst housing crises in Western Europe. And if we look at rents, you mentioned there 19% increasing. Rents have increased in the private market by 100% in the last 10 years. And we've seen, for what I describe as a generation locked out of not just being able to buy a home, but even being able to rent a home. And we've had this emergence of what I call generation stuck at home. And these are adults who are in their 20s, in their 30s, who cannot move out of the parents' home. And to give you a figure on the scale of that, in 2012, there was 35% of 25 to 29-year-olds living at home in the parental home. Now we're over 60% of that age group are stuck living in their parents' home. They cannot have independence. I describe it as the infantilization of a generation. And we're really seeing, shocking both economic and social impacts in Ireland of this housing crisis. Schools not being able to get teachers, hospitals not being able to get nurses, average income workers who in the past, even 20 years ago, were able to buy a home, now can no longer buy a home in any of the big cities or even the smaller cities. So we have what I describe as a breaking of the social contract in Ireland, which used to you could either access home ownership or get social housing, but now for younger generations, they can't access either.
Rory, I saw a story in one of the Irish papers recently where Ryanair, the airline, bought up several houses on a new build development of property in Swords, quite a nice suburb of Dublin. I mean, how much anger is there amongst young people when they see a massive corporation company like Ryanair swooping in and buying property that really should be housing young families?
There is huge anger. And people really feel, younger people, and again, younger, I'm using that in a broad sense, people in their 30s, mid-30s, are really angry. And just give you one example, I was contacted by a woman who's 35 yesterday, who is living in social housing, but she is living with her partner in a bedroom with the partner's brother, who is in his 20s. So there's three of them in that bedroom. She's in her mid-30s with her partner, both of them working. They don't qualify for social housing. They don't have enough to get a mortgage to buy a home. So they're basically stuck. And she feels absolutely hopeless. And she is emblematic of a generation that I would argue have been abandoned in terms of the Irish government's decades failure, as Sorcha outlined there in terms of across Europe, but particularly in Ireland, that shift away from the building of social housing and from governments and states seeing social housing as being a core part of their responsibility. What used to be a core part of the welfare state then was handed over to the market. But in Ireland, we had a particular extreme marketisation in the last 10 years, where governments invited in these vulture funds, real estate funds, to recover the economy after the crash, but they brought them into property and property investment. And so we've seen this huge expansion of build-to-rent accommodation at rents that nobody can afford.
Sorcha, give us an impression of life in Belgium. What's it like for young people, or anyone indeed, trying to get on the property ladder? Are you seeing similar challenges? I appreciate Ireland's probably at the extreme end of the scale, but what's it like in Belgium?
Well, actually, we're really focused on the pan-European point here, and I'd like to just actually really bring home that point that Rory just made, and the fact that governments have been abandoning investment in social housing. And I think what illustrates it quite well is that if we look at 19 billion has been invested in so-called capital investment, just between 2021 and 2022. And if we compare the same figure, governments paying for people to stay in private rental accommodation, that figure is 44 billion. So we see that the mistakes that have been made, so the slowdown in delivery of social housing, that we also see a severe lack here in Belgium, with half of the city of Brussels actually eligible for social housing and only 6% of people actually being in social housing. So you have more people on the waiting list than you actually have in social housing in Belgium, and growing prices and growing interest also coming from investors. But would also like to bring up the point that Rory made about the social cost of this. So we see now in Europe 46% of people living in rental accommodation fear the risk of losing their home for economic reasons. And so we hear the social cost of that, about an individual story of that 35-year-old woman. However, what is the hidden social cost of those 46% of people who are actually living in fear of losing their home with potentially no other option? But actually closer to our daily activities here in Eisen Europe, we're looking also at the political cost. So what will be the political impact of this fear that people are living in, this the fact that such a basic need has become become completely unaffordable for such a big proportion of the population? And what will the political fallout of that be coming up in the local and European elections that we're going to see this year?
Manjinder, in the UK, am I right in thinking that the phrase social housing, if you speak to people in Britain, certainly at the political class level, it's almost a dirty word. It's almost a dirty phrase. They don't want to engage with it. They don't want to invest in it. Is that a fair assessment?
I would agree. With the whole rent to buy scheme that came out with the Conservative years ago. These properties, I think it's about 2 million properties, haven't been replaced. So the lack of investment, the lack of social housing or types of housing, it's a big problem in the UK. There's so many people on the homelessness register, housing register with local authorities, but unfortunately there are not enough properties available. So what local authorities are doing is moving these people into private rental accommodation, and landlords are aware of the need and the demand of properties, so the rent is increasing as a result, which is then becoming unaffordable to people who are on welfare benefits, or because the welfare system hasn't really reflected the cost of living in the UK.
And Manjinder, you've an election coming possibly in October in the United Kingdom. Do you think social housing may get a look in as a big talking point in that debate?
Yes, the Renters Reform Bill is been spoken about for almost 4 years, as I'm aware. We were promised it would come into play before the elections. I don't think that's going to happen. The Renters Reform Bill, if it's done correctly, will give empowerment to tenants in the UK. However, it's not going to address, I do not believe, address the affordability issue that we have in the UK. It will give tenants some power to negotiate on rent increases, but that doesn't stop the landlords increasing the rent subject to the market, the rental market. So there's always going to be a problem with affordability unless the government take control and perhaps reintroduce rental controls within the UK to help adjust and balance the rental market in the UK.
Rory, an election coming in Ireland in the next 12 months as well. I see Mary Lou McDonald from Sinn Féin in opposition now. Every time she speaks, she's mentioning housing and what she will do and her plans to build more and more affordable housing. I mean, is this likely to be the big issue in Ireland?
I think there's no doubt it will be the big issue. In the last general election in 2020, housing became the biggest issue during the election, and in particular amongst younger people who voted in their 20s and 30s, it was the number one issue on which they voted. People in their 50s and 60s, health was the major issue they voted on. We can see now that in all the polls, it shows housing is the number one concern of people. Unfortunately, after that 2020 election, we didn't see a change in policy. The government's Housing for All policy that was launched subsequent to that was in the middle of COVID. And the government at the time implemented a number of measures that were implemented across Europe actually at that time, things like an eviction ban, rent freeze, and we actually saw homelessness fall and rents stabilised. But of course, what happened after COVID was those measures were lifted, and we have seen the eviction ban, evictions, an unprecedented scale of evictions. And I talk about this here, and I'm still shocked at how there's not more concern in government currently, but across the system around this. We are having now, last year, there was 19,000 households evicted. During the height of the famine in this country in the 1850s, it was about 8,000 families at the height evicted. The scale of evictions that are going on, and these are no-fault evictions, it's phenomenal, and homelessness. And I think what you're going to see in this election is this general election, the coming locals, Europeans, housing will be the key issue on which people vote. We're seeing, as Sorcha said, some people similar to the Netherlands and other countries trying to turn that anger and frustration over housing onto migrants, onto asylum seekers. But most people are seeing through that, and they're very much saying, no, we need a change in policy that will make a serious investment in social and affordable housing, that will tackle things like the massive issue of vacant properties. Airbnb is a massive issue as well, and also particularly the whole issue of rents and the lack of tenant security.
Sorcha, would you like to see the European Union get more involved and maybe come out with a common policy on housing for governments to meet certain targets year on year?
So I think we are a long way from that now, but we have taken a step in the right direction. So actually, the ministers responsible for housing took a 10-year break, if you like. So they didn't meet each other for 10 years as this problem was getting worse and worse. Now, though, so the last 3 years, they are again sitting around the table, which I think is definitely a positive sign for us. And they're sending a clear signal also. So under the Belgian presidency running at the moment, they met in Liège just a few weeks ago, and they did send a common message to the EU, recognizing that, yes, throughout the EU, we are facing similar, if not exactly the same, but similar trends around the lack of affordable housing that is putting the social fabric, but also the competitiveness of our industry and the commercial sector at risk. So there was a clear message sent there with the backing of the Belgian presidency. And okay, whether we want the EU stepping in here. So what was definitely called for was more coherence from EU level, because what you see actually from here is that although the EU has no competence, so no clear legal competence, so it's not their job to look at housing, there quite a few of their policies do have an impact. If we look at the regulation of short-term letting, for instance, they do have an impact there, and they've recently brought in a directive to at least increase the transparency, so that the public sector does have access to information about how many short-term lets are active at any given time. We also have rules coming from EU level around state aid. But the key concern is indeed this lack of coherence. So different types of policy coming from EU level that have an indirect impact. But we can't move away from the fact that the power here is largely local. And I think Rory just outlined a couple of the policies that were brought in during COVID. What is stopping local authorities and governments really stepping in here and realizing, look, this is a public good. Having affordable housing should be the equivalent of having affordable healthcare, affordable education. And actually, there are clear measures that can be taken around new construction, but also transformation of existing buildings, a better use of existing empty homes or even offices.
The UK is likely to see a new government at some point in the next 5 or 6 months. Labour under Keir Starmer heading towards Downing Street, if you believe the polls. Do you think Labour will be better?
Well, I'm not going to go into my political views, but I think a change in government policy, I think a change in the focus on housing is essential to any government that, does start in the UK. I think it's important that homelessness is addressed. There's also been issues with our welfare system, which also needs to reflect on the cost of housing. So any government that does come to the UK is that I think that a focus on housing is imperative. Homelessness is at its high. The amount of homelessness clients that we deal with on a daily basis, it's concerning. In my whole career, 15 years, I've never seen so many homelessness clients that approach us for help, and they range from young clients to elderly to pensioners. So it's definitely any government that comes in, a focus on housing is imperative.
Rory, in Ireland, are Sinn Féin onto a winner with their housing policy, do you think?
Well, I think it's a big question as to, what is the change that, they're offering. And, I should declare I am, a candidate as well for the Social Democrats in the upcoming European elections. So I suppose in terms of what I feel that is needed, and, it would be at some extent similar to what Sinn Féin are advocating, which is that strong shift to the state. And I think it's a fundamental recognition, both ourselves and the Social Democrats and Sinn Féin are, putting across, which is completely in line with social policy and the research that myself and others have done, and people like, Sorcha in Housing Europe, which is this fundamental idea that we need to treat housing as both a human right and a public good, and that those two key aspects have been completely lost in a lot of European countries, and indeed not just in Europe, across the world over the last 40 years under what we would broadly call the neoliberal or financialized era, where we've seen this shift away from the state being responsible for key public goods, in contrast to the Keynesian period post-World War II. And it has been of disastrous consequences. And one of the most disastrous areas has been in housing. And this idea that somehow the private market will provide housing and sufficient housing has just been an utter disaster. It's bad theory, it's bad policy. And I think that in terms of a new government in Ireland and the opposition parties, I think what the potential is that within an election, by offering a real, I suppose, alternative, as Sorcha used the phrase, paradigm, in terms of how we understand housing and how we treat housing, we can, over the short, medium, and ultimately long term, because it is going to take a long time to change our housing systems. But we need to start going in the right direction. Currently, we're still very much going in the market-dominated approach. And if we continue on that road, and particularly the financialized investor funds, the crisis will continue to get worse. And so we need a dramatic shift back to the state playing a central role. And that means, funding local authorities, funding not-for-profit housing bodies, cooperatives, and providing as much housing as possible outside the market, both rental and home ownership, in my view as well.
Rory, Sorcha and Manjinder, thank you all so much. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.